Hello. This is a talk that I wrote to give to the volunteers at a museum where I volunteer, and I thought it would be interesting to share it more broadly. Before I get into the meat of the talk, I'd like to talk a little bit about SpaceX just in general, because they're a pretty unique company in a couple ways. First off, their model is much more like what we would expect to see in the software industry than what we typically see in aerospace. Though if you know the history of aviation and know what Lockheed did when they developed the U-2 and the SR-71, you'll probably notice some parallels. In addition, SpaceX is unique in that it is a tremendously open company. The amount of information that they share publicly is at least an order of magnitude bigger than what we see from any other company out there. So, before we move on and talk about the specific topic, which is going to be about Starship, I'd like to talk about where SpaceX is now. And that means talking about the Falcon family. So we'll start with the Falcon 9. This is SpaceX's workhorse rocket. They've been flying it since 2010. It's 3.7 meters, or about 12 feet in diameter. It's classed as a medium lift class, about 22 metric tons to a low Earth orbit, and about 8 metric tons to geosynchronous transfer orbit. It has done 78 launches, a mixture of commercial satellites, NASA science launches, DoD launches, a lot of launches to ISS resupply, and they're currently in the process of doing commercial crew launches. The current first launch of astronauts on their Dragon 2 capsule is scheduled for late May. Now, beyond the Falcon 9, they have the Falcon Heavy. And the Falcon Heavy consists just of 3 Falcon 9 first stages hooked together, kind of strengthened, and a second stage and a normal payload fairing on top. This is classed as a super heavy lift rocket, 63 metric tons to low Earth orbit, 26 metric tons to geosynchronous transfer orbit. It was originally designed to overcome Falcon 9 limitations. So the original Falcon 9 did not have enough performance to be able to launch all of the commercial satellites that kind of make up the big bulk of the market. So SpaceX essentially did 2 separate programs. They did the Falcon Heavy program, and they did a program to uprate the Falcon 9. Now, what happened was they were very successful with uprating the Falcon 9 and pretty much doubled its payload capability. What that means is the Falcon Heavy has only done 3 flights, and it has a limited market. There are some Department of Defense, National Space Launch, geosynchronous launches that require Falcon Heavy class performance. There might be some very heavy communication satellites that require it, and it could be used on planetary science missions. But, as you can see, only 3 flights so far. Notable achievements for SpaceX. They were the first privately funded liquid-fueled rocket to reach orbit and to launch a commercial satellite. They were the first private company to send a spacecraft to ISS, to launch a geosynchronous satellite, to refly a cargo spacecraft, and to dock a human-rated spacecraft with ISS. Now, I've left off what I think are the most interesting achievements, and those are all around recovery and reuse. SpaceX has notably been able to land and reuse the first stage of their Falcon rockets, and they've landed a first stage 50 times now, which is pretty impressive. So, what does a Falcon 9 or Falcon Heavy launch look like? Well, I've taken this pretty complicated and ugly diagram and covered it up with all these ugly things so I can talk about a little bit at a time. So we'll start down here with the launch, and this shows a Falcon Heavy. It equally applies to Falcon 9 or really to pretty much any other commercial rocket at this point. So we launch. A period of time later, we've used up all the propellant in the first stage. And at that point, the first stage is just dead weight. So we jettison it. We start the second stage. Sometime after that, we get into orbit, or we get out of the Earth's atmosphere, and we jettison the fairings that are protecting the satellite on top. At this point, they're just dead weight. And then eventually, in the upper right, we reach the orbit that we want, and we separate the payload, and we are done. Now, during this cycle, with most rockets, the first stage falls into the ocean someplace. The fairings fall into the ocean or burn up, or a combination. And the second stage is either deorbited back into the Earth's atmosphere where it burns up, or it's placed in a parking orbit. It depends upon the mission. So what SpaceX does is notably different. So starting at first stage separation, the first stage has thrusters on it, and it flips around to point in the opposite direction. And then it relights its engines in what's called a boost back burn to lose some speed and to bring the trajectory towards the landing site. Now after that, soon after, it deploys a set of what are called grid fins, which are aerodynamic control surfaces, and they're different than normal ones in that they work both at low speed and at very high speeds, supersonic speeds. A little bit later, as the first stage comes back into the atmosphere, it does what's called an entry burn. So it relights the engines, that takes off some of the speed, and the exhaust of the engines also pushes some of the re-entry heating away from the rocket. So that protects the engines as well. Entry burns are only about 20 seconds, so it just takes a little speed off, slows it down a little. Then there's a long period of time where it's just guided by the grid fins, which can steer it and aim it, and by the cold gas thrusters if those are needed as well. And you'll notice in this picture that the rocket is kind of pointed to the right. The grid fins can be used to control the attitude, how the rocket is falling through the air, and that gives it some lift. So you can actually make the rocket move left or right, or in whatever direction you want on the way coming down. And finally, eventually, when it gets close to landing, the engines are relit, the landing legs deploy, and it lands, in this case, out on an autonomous drone ship, typically in the Atlantic. This drone ship, the Atlantic one, is called Of Course I Still Love You. That's named after one of the ships in the Culture series of novels. So we've landed the first stage, but remember I talked about earlier about we have these fairings and we just toss them away. And fairings look like they're kind of a minor part. All they really are is just enclosures. But on a rocket like the Falcon 9 or Falcon Heavy, the space enclosed by the fairing is big enough to hold a school bus set on its back. So these are really big structures. And because they need to be light, they're typically made out of carbon fiber. So big and light carbon fiber means expensive. And they cost somewhere on the order of $5 or $6 million for a set. So SpaceX has also been working on recovering the fairings. So the fairings, for a long time, they just fall, and then when they get back into the atmosphere, they deploy steerable parachutes. And SpaceX has 2 recovery ships with large nets on them, and they attempt to go around and catch the fairings in the nets. Now, they've only actually caught 2 fairings out of all the times they've tried. It turns out that catching fairings is actually considerably more difficult, technically, than vertical landing of the first stage, which is, I guess, a bit surprising. They have also found that some of the fairings land softly enough in the water that they can take them out and reuse them at that point. So this is pretty much what you would see for a normal Falcon 9 launch. Since the beginning graphics showed a Falcon Heavy, we're going to go back and explore what is different about the Falcon Heavy. And what is different is we have those 2 boosters. And the 2 boosters put out essentially more power than the center core. The center core is throttled back early on, which means the two boosters use up their fuel a little early. So they both pop off. They spin around. They do a booster boost back burn. And in this case, they do enough of a boost back burn to send them back to the launch site. They do an entry burn, and then they ultimately land pretty near to the launch site, about 10 miles away. So that's basically what a Falcon 9 or Falcon Heavy profile looks like. Now, let's look at an edited video. This is a video edited from one of their webcasts to kind of just show the parts that I showed here. And I added a little voiceover to do some explanation. This is the third launch of Falcon Heavy for Arabsat 6A, April 2019. This is pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition, liftoff.
The voices you hear are SpaceX employees.
We're beginning deep throttle.
Waiting for the three boosters to stage.
Pico.
Booster separation confirmed.
Now you can notice the left and right boosters using their thrusters to turn around.
Side boosters now beginning a flip to begin returning back to Cape Canaveral. Side boosters have begun the boost back burn. The center core has throttled back up to power. Everything looking good on the flight of Falcon Heavy. The next major event, main engine cutoff of the center core and separation ignition of the second stage. Bottom middle view shows the view looking up into the nozzle of the second stage engine.
Top view shows the second stage engine.
Miko.
Main engine cutoff, center core is shut
Stage
down.
separation confirmed.
Now coming up at about T plus 6 minutes will be the side boosters re-entry burn.
In the middle, you can see the grid fins of the center core.
So you'll see the side boosters on your left and right screen.
Side booster entry burn has started.
And there's the re-entry burn beginning.
Next up is the landing.
Stage 2 trajectory nominal.
Side booster landing burn has started.
The landing zone is about 10 miles south of the launch pad.
So again, as we mentioned earlier, this is going to be a challenging landing.
Stage 1 landing
and we
burn
are
is starting.
landing on our drone ship. Of course, I still love you. And
Center core runways are deployed.
looks like we lost the live view. Waiting for some confirmation, and it sounds like we landed the center core on our drone ship. We have landed the center core for the first time on our drone ship. Of course, I Still Love You. For the first time, we've landed all 3 boosters for Falcon Heavy. What an amazing day. So now we are going to take a quick break. You can hear our crowd going wild. 3 for...
Okay, so now that I've talked a bit about where SpaceX is with the Falcon series, now I'd like to talk about their aspirations. And their aspirations are based upon something they're calling the Mars Transportation Architecture. And Musk's goal, and therefore SpaceX's goal, is not only to get to Mars, but to get to Mars in large ships that carry a lot, both a lot of cargo and a lot of people. So here's what the architecture is that they're planning on using. And we start with a 2-stage rocket, lift off, and the booster comes back and returns to the launch site. So pretty much the same way the Falcon 9 could do now, except always landing at the launch site. So we start with that, and then we end up with the second stage, which flies into Earth orbit. Now that's great. The problem is the second stage now has empty propellant tanks, so it can't really go anyplace. So what we do is we take that same booster stage and we launch a number of tankers to refill the first ship. And they're going to refill it with liquid oxygen as the oxidizer, and CH4 there is methane, so liquid methane as the propellant. And then the tankers come back and land. So now we have a ship refueled into Earth orbit, and it can now fly across to Mars and eventually land on the surface. So now we have the same problem we had in Earth orbit. We have a ship on Martian surface and we don't have any fuel in it. So what can we do? Well, it turns out if you have power and you can get water from the Martian surface, you can use the power, the water, and the CO2 in the Martian atmosphere, and you can create methane and oxygen, which are the propellants you need. So you can create those propellants, chill them down, and refuel the ship. Now it turns out, luckily, that the Martian gravity is low enough that you don't need a 2-stage rocket to get into orbit. You can do it just with the upper stage here. So the upper stage takes off, it travels back to orbit, and then it re-enters and lands. So this is the architecture that SpaceX is working towards. Now to do this, you will need a different system than the Falcon 9. And this is what SpaceX is currently calling Starship. It was sometimes known as BFR, and for a while it was known as Mars Colonial Transport. So the top stage is called Starship. It's 9 meters or 30 feet in diameter, so about 2.5 times the size of Falcon 9. It has 6 Raptor engines. I'll talk about the Raptors in a few minutes. It's orbital and it's reusable. So to launch something that big, you need a big launcher. And the big launcher, and it has fins for aerodynamic control. We'll also talk about those in a bit. The bottom stage is called Super Heavy. And basically, Super Heavy is sized to be big enough to launch Starship into orbit. It will have somewhere on the order of 37 Raptor engines, and it will have 72 meganewtons of thrust, about double what the Saturn V had at liftoff. So it's a very big rocket. It will also be reusable, and it will also land at the launch site. So you can think of Super Heavy being designed to lift Starship and land back where it took off from. To do that, they needed a new engine, and that new engine is called Raptor. Raptor is a liquid methane, liquid oxygen engine. That's sometimes called methalox. As I noted earlier, you can manufacture both liquid oxygen and methane on Mars. Liquid methane is considerably easier to deal with than liquid hydrogen. It's closer in density and temperature to liquid oxygen, which makes it easier to deal with. And it's a higher density than liquid hydrogen, which makes it a better choice, especially for first stages. You need smaller first stages. And compared to the kerosene that is used in Falcon 9, it burns a lot cleaner, and that is better for reusability. Raptor uses what's called full flow staged combustion, which is really the holy grail of combustion efficiency. This gives you the most efficient, the most propulsion out of a given amount of fuel. And Raptor is the first engine ever flown using this design. Both the US and the Soviets did kind of prototypes, but they never actually got to engines that flew. Size-wise, Raptor is expected to put out about 1,700 kilonewtons of thrust. As a comparison, the Merlin engine on the Falcon 9 puts out about half that. The RS-25 Space Shuttle main engine puts out about a quarter of that. And the giant F1 engine used on the Apollo first stage puts out just a huge 6,700 kilonewtons, which is more than 3 times what the Raptor will put out. That's why the Apollo first stage could get away with 5 engines, and the Super Heavy first stage is expected to have 30-some. Another interesting way of evaluating engines is thrust-to-weight ratio. How much propulsion do you get out for a given pound or a given kilogram of weight in the engine? This is especially important for second stage engines. And Raptor is expected to be about 170. The F1 on the Apollo first stage, on the Saturn 1 first stage, it's 94. The RS-25 is kind of surprisingly only 73. It puts out a lot of thrust, but it's a heavy, complex engine. And the Merlin on the F9 is kind of a ridiculous 180. So, since we can, so that is one of the indications that test firing, not only that the engine works, but that SpaceX is willing to share things that no other company would really share with you. You know, a development test firing. So before we go on, I'd like to talk a little bit about how Starship and Shuttle would be different. Because they really use different techniques for how they're going to re-enter the atmosphere. Now, the Space Shuttle is a glider. It's not a very good glider. It has small wings and it's really heavy, but it is a glider. And by that I mean the Space Shuttle was controlled with traditional airplane-style aerodynamic surfaces. It has a rudder in the back, it has elevons in the back, and it is flown, and it needs to be moving forward when it flies. Now, it does fly with a very high angle of attack. The nose is very high, but it still glides. Starship is described as skydiving, and the way it comes in is really much more like what we would traditionally expect a capsule to coming in from reentry. A very flat reentry, kind of a very high drag approach. And it has fins on it, and the fins are used to control its orientation, but it's never really gliding. It isn't moving forward the way a plane would be moving forward. And the way that works is it will come in and do a very flat entry, and with the nose up a little, and then once it gets near the landing site, it'll pretty much be falling flat. And when it gets very low, right near the bottom, it will do a reorientation around so that the tail is down, and then it will do a landing burn and land the way the Falcon 9 first stage lands now. So a very different approach. Now, one of the things you'll note here is that unlike the Falcon 9, there's no boost back burn, and there is no boost back burn, no entry burn. So we're just using thermal protection and aerodynamics to get back where we want to. Now, the shuttle, as you may know, used ceramic tiles and other thermal protection systems on it. SpaceX, it's actually not clear what they're going to use yet. It's a work in progress. So, Starship development. This is how the Starship project started. And what that big thing is that's what's called a mandrel. And a mandrel is what you use for making large carbon fiber tubes, essentially. So think you mount that on an axle, and you spin it around, and as it spins around, you wrap carbon fiber strands back and forth across it. And then when you're done, you take that whole thing and you put it in a really big oven, and that cures the carbon fiber. And then you pull that off, and you have a long carbon fiber tube. And similarly, they built carbon fiber tank prototypes. So for a tank, you need the two ends. So they built this test thing. So you take the tube off the mandrel, you add these two ends, and that gives you a large carbon fiber tank. And the original plan was that they would build these tubes or these tanks someplace, maybe in the Puget Sound area. They would ship them down to Los Angeles, to the port of Los Angeles, and assemble the vehicle there. And then they would take that vehicle and ship it, way too big to ship over land, so you ship it through the Panama Canal to your launch site. So this was how Starship development started. And for launch sites, way back in 2012, SpaceX started working in this area of Texas called Boca Chica. And Boca Chica is the farthest southern coastline in Texas. So it's just barely north of Mexico. And southern coastlines are really good for rockets. So you want something south, because the farther south, the more benefit you get from launching, from the Earth's rotation. And you want it on the coastline to the east, so that if you're launching expendable rockets, or even if you're launching reusable rockets, so the launch happens over water, you're not doing it over inhabited areas. So SpaceX bought this, but they had a problem. This is the Rio Grande River Delta, which means it's kind of marshy and not very solid ground, and you can't really build a launch pad on it. So the way you compact the soil is you bring in this big pile of soil, and you just pile it up over the spot you want to use as a launch pad, and you let the weight do that. So SpaceX did that, and that just sat there for a lot of years. And then finally, in September 2018, stuff started happening. And you remember this picture I showed you at the beginning. This is a field in Boca Chica. And Boca Chica isn't really a city. It's just kind of a small cluster of a few houses. There used to be, if I recall correctly, a house in the middle here. And there's really just not a lot there. Really no business. So in 2018, people started seeing something happen here. And we eventually came across this picture. And this picture was actually taken by one of the local residents. There really aren't any structures on this stretch of road. And this person, she just noticed something was going on, and she took this picture. And it ended up showing up somehow with some SpaceX enthusiasts. So it's like, oh, while they're doing something at this site, they've put up one of these tents. And then soon after that, in November, there was a tweet from Musk, and he said, we're building a BFR dev ship to do supersonic through landing tests in Boca Chica, Texas. And this made a lot of sense. You know, there was a lot of speculation that they would be launching from Boca Chica. And okay, so they're starting to do the creation for that. And then things got weird. the same person who took that earlier picture on December 14th posted this picture. And we have that same tint, but we have something in front. And if you measure that, coincidentally, it's about the right size for Starship. Okay? But what does it look like? Well, it looks like a water tower. A few days later, we got another picture, and we saw there were some slots cut in it. And on this time, there was all this discussion back and forth about what this might be. Is it a prototype for Starship? Is it a mock-up? Is it an observation tower that just happens to be, the same size as Starship? And it's in about the right location for an observation tower. And there were lots of opinions that went both ways. Here's one that I particularly liked. And it could just be a water tower. So here's the opinion. Seriously, other than a water tower, what else could it be? A base for another tracking antenna? It's a foundation for a structure, not a play spaceship. So that was kind of one of the opinions there. And then somebody went back and found this tweet from Musk about a week earlier. And in it he said, "The new design is metal, fairly heavy metal, but extremely strong." It's like, well, fairly heavy metal, extremely strong, means steel. And if you look at that structure in the background, well, that looks like it's pretty heavy and it looks like it's steel. And there was still a lot of discussions back and forth. And then finally, about a week later, we got this tweet from Musk, and he said, "I'll do a full technical presentation of Starship after the test vehicle we're building in Texas flies. So hopefully in March and April." And basically at this point, it looked pretty clear that SpaceX had decided that Starship was not going to be made out of carbon fiber. It was going to be made out of steel, specifically stainless steel. And then 2 days later, on Christmas Eve, we got this picture, which says stainless steel Starship. And on the right in the back, you can see the original structure, now with landing legs hooked up. And then the left, you can see a nose cone for it. I'll notice they're both made out of stainless steel. The one on the left looks black, simply because there's no light on it, like the one on the right. So that was in December, and that became what is known as Starhopper. And it got called Starhopper pretty quickly. The rocket that SpaceX built to test first stage landing for Falcon was called Grasshopper. This is Starship, so it got called Starhopper. And by August of that year, so about 8 months later, they had it finished into this form. They had one Raptor engine, an early design Raptor engine underneath. You can just see it pointing out. And you can see it's pretty crude looking. So a few weeks later, this happened. And we can skip ahead, and we can see it sitting on the ground, venting. Now, at this point, there was a lot of discussion as to what this meant, or how big of an accomplishment this was. This was the first flight of the Raptor engine, and that was obviously important. But this clearly doesn't really look like Starship in any of the designs that I showed you before. And it's way, way too heavy. So there's a lot of discussion about it. And it turns out what SpaceX is really doing at Boca Chica, they are building prototypes, but what they're really doing is building their Starship factory. And they're building it incrementally. So what they know is they're going to build a series of vehicles, and each one is going to get a little better. And they will learn both about the design and about their construction techniques. And then when they get done with this, they'll have something that builds the starships they actually want to build. So after Starship, we got what's called Mark 1. And Mark 1 is the flight design. It includes fins both at the front and the back. And you'll notice that this design is a 2-fin design. The early Starship I showed was a 3-fin design. This is the current design. You'll notice it looks better made than Starhopper. They're already building things better. You also note that, hey, this is a pretty big ship. So they unveiled this on 9/28, so September 2019. And then a couple months later, they'd finished a bunch of installation stuff, and they put it on a carrier, ran it down the road to the launch pad for a pressure test. And I don't have a video of the pressure test, but you can see from these pictures that the pressure test was not particularly successful. The top bulkhead, the welds did not hold, and it vented off, and we ended up with a very crushed Starship off on the right. But remember, as I said, the point of what they're doing is to figure out if their design works and figure out if their construction methods work. They're building the factory to build the Starship. And so it's not unexpected that they're going to run into issues like this. So that was Mark 1. After this, SpaceX does something they've done in the past. They switch their nomenclature. So we went from Mark 1 through Mark N to serial number 1 through serial number N. And now they're switching to new, better welding techniques. And they're all the way to what they expect their steel thickness is going to be. So Starhopper used 12 millimeter steel, so about 1/2 inch thick. Serial number 1 is using 4 millimeter steel, so only 1/3 of the thickness. So much thinner, much harder to weld. So serial number 1, that got built. And what happened to it? Okay, so I'll scroll ahead again. Basically, at the bottom of the rocket is the bulkhead where the engines mount. And that bulkhead, the welds broke. And then the whole structure, the whole stage went up. And when it landed, the top bulkhead broke. Some people have suggested that serial number 1 actually did fly. You can see it flew, it just did not fly very well. And once again, as I said, the whole point of doing this is to validate the designs and validate the construction methods. And it's expected that they will have issues along the way. And it's pretty typical for aerospace companies to have issues along the way. Typically, we don't get to see them on the web broadcast in real time. So that was serial number 1. Here's serial number 2. Okay, so SpaceX was in the middle of starting serial number 2 when they were testing serial number 1. And they had a redesign for the aft end where the engines would mount. They wanted to validate that that was okay. They didn't want to build a whole vehicle and have it fail again. So they essentially built a very abbreviated version of serial number 2. All it has is the top bulkhead and the bottom bulkhead that failed. So they built that, took that over, I don't have a video as it passed the pressure test. I guess we could just sit and watch it sit there for a few hours, but that wouldn't be very exciting. The important point is there was only 2 weeks between the failed pressure test of serial number 1 and the passed pressure test of serial number 2 on the redesigned version. So that's one of the indications of the approach that SpaceX is taking and how quickly they can move. So, what happened after serial number 1? Well, I mean serial number 2. Obviously, serial number 3. It's under construction. And I took this picture. Well, I didn't take this picture. I acquired this picture when I first started writing this presentation, which was 2 or 3 weeks ago. But, of course, things are going on. And more recently, I got this picture. So what we see in this is the left portion is the upper part. You can think of this as having most of the top tank and part of the middle tank. And then on the right, we see the propulsion section. So that has the bottom bulkhead that they had issues with in the past. And then at the bottom, those bottom 2 sections are actually a skirt that will go around and hide the rockets. So you won't see the actual rocket engine sticking out. And that's for re-entry purposes. And then this picture came out, which shows the 2 of them mated together. And then a little bit later, this picture came out. And this picture actually shows serial number 3, which has been transported out to the launch site. And it's being put on the launch and testing mount. And currently we expect that they will be doing a static fire, which means they're going to test the engines in, I don't know, a few days from now. It's kind of hard to know. So that's where they are in current design and construction. As far as the Boca Chica factory, well, different people have spent a lot of time taking pictures. Some people have done drone flights, which aren't allowed anymore. Some people have done kite flights, but it's a little hard to figure out what's going on just looking at them. Nicely, some of the SpaceX fans have taken on a task to create a 3D model from what is known about the factory. And so this is a flyover from March 17th of that 3D model. Of course, it's already out of date because we're a couple weeks beyond there. But what you can see is where originally we just had that field and really nothing around it. We now have several large tints. We have other tints under construction. We have the high bay, which is what we saw in the background in the pictures of serial number 3. And different various parts lying around. And not only is there a fly-through of these now and then, you can go and look at a 3D model viewer. So you can look around and zoom in, zoom out, and do all of that. And this is updated about every couple of weeks these days. Moving on, what about launch pad? So here we have the Super Heavy orbital launch pad, and the fact that it has a very large truck in the background is pretty indicative of the amount of construction they're doing there. There's this very, very nice panorama taken, and this is standing on the beach right next to the Gulf of Mexico. So the Gulf of Mexico is behind us. On the right, you can see Starhopper, which remains at the launch site. The plan is that it will be used as an engine test mount. Kind of on the right, you can see the tanks for water and for the liquid propellants. And kind of in the middle, you will see the launch mount. That's the same thing we saw serial number 3 being lowered onto. Kind of way back in the middle, you'll see one of the tracking dishes. And then at the back on the left, you will see the factory site that we just looked at. So you can see the 2 big tents. You can see the nose for serial number 3, and then you can see the high bay on the right. So what's upcoming? So launch pads. So I talked about Boca Chica that's under construction. SpaceX is also planning on modifying Pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center. Now this is one of their Falcon 9, Falcon Heavy launch pads. And it's also the one that they will be launching astronauts from as part of the commercial crew program. And they are modifying this to be a Starship pad as well, mostly because it's expedient to do so. So Kennedy Space Center is in a wildlife preserve, so it takes a lot of time to get anything new permitted, and it's a swamp, so it's very difficult to build anything. It would take a long time to build a new pad. So what they've elected to do is, rather than modify the Falcon pad, they are going to build a new pad. You can see it's labeled Starship Pad, kind of down and to the right of the Falcon pad. The plan is that Starship will launch from an elevated pad, and instead of having a big concrete flame trench and structure that it sits on, it will have a steel structure that's water cooled. What that gives them is a way to build something quickly, and then they can leverage the existing liquid oxygen farm, and they can repurpose what was the liquid hydrogen farm for shuttle launches and use that for liquid methane. And then they'll be able to launch from here, and then they have a landing zone very near the launch site. So think of Starship and Super Heavy taking off and Super Heavy landing right here, and probably Starship landing right here as well. So all of that's important for their goals of quick turnaround. For flight tests, so assuming that the serial number 3 tests currently plan to go off, there's probably a 150 millimeter hop, which is about what Starhopper did sometime in early April. There is a hop to 20 kilometers planned for serial number something, probably not 3, but maybe 4 or 5. And then after that, the next big goal will be to build a Super Heavy and to do orbital tests after that. The orbital tests are going to be a requirement for them to validate their reentry approach and their thermal protection system. So that's all I had. I'd like to give a few thank yous. The first is to SpaceX, both for doing projects like this and for being so open about it. The second is NASASpaceflight.com, who hosts an incredible set of forums with more information on this than you could want. You could make a full-time job of keeping track of SpaceX information there. And finally, John Krause Photography, who does wonderful shots, and his shots were the ones I used for the Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy. And then finally, to the countless SpaceX fans that are out there, and keeping track of all this information and centralizing it and making it available to everyone else.